The rocket that was fired at the Al Jazeera tent was from an F-35 that had Australian parts. Australia has not stopped any of its exports, any of its trade with the Zionist entity.
Anyone who goes down this path is not interested in the liberation of Palestine. Anyone who accepts this framework of this sort of reality.
Anyone who's supporting this is supporting the Zionist plot.
اوكي اعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers, sisters, friends in Australia and all over the world, for this latest episode of the Stand4Palestine podcast. We are now beyond the 2 episodes. Whether this is number 3 or number 4, we don't know. So I'm not going to say which number it is, but the team will figure that out. I'm absolutely delighted to have everyone here with us on this episode. Thank you for watching. And a reminder to click like, to comment if you can, and to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Those are the instructions I'm given by the team. But make sure you do that. And alhamdulillah, it's early days, but we're chipping away and making an important contribution, I feel, and we feel, to the community conversation. And may Allah put barakah in our humble efforts. We're recording this podcast at possibly the worst time imaginable. Really, I can't imagine how much worse it can get, but that's what we're here to discuss with our dear brother Mohammed. Mohammed, welcome. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you so much for coming back on. This is your second time that you're with us. I think last time we were discussing, what were we discussing? We were discussing
the
famine,
starvation in Gaza.
That's right, which was the big sort of talking point 2 or 3 weeks ago, and now it's sort of like last week it was all about the, everything being on the verge of absolute annihilation. And then, somehow they've let some aid through and airdrops and all that sort of stuff. So things have changed a little bit, but, we've just seen the dark couple of days after the passing of Anas al-Sharif and the other Al Jazeera journalists. And that's come as a huge blow because they really were the voice of Gaza in some way. And whether to coincide, probably not. It was building up already. We've had this thing about the recognition of the Palestinian state. And that is the motivating factor, the animating factor, I should say, behind today's episode. So we're going to dive into all things to do with the recognition of the Palestinian state. What does it actually mean? The history of the idea, and how we should sort of process that as Muslims who care about Gaza, or people of conscience, in fact, I'm sure, because we won't just have Muslims listening today. So that's what this is all about. So look, let's rip right in, inshallah. And, I guess the context is that I was going to say our good mate, but he's not, as history has shown over the last 2 years. Anthony Albanese, this Monday made the announcement that Australia would recognise a Palestinian state at the United Nations General Assembly on something September. It's a big meeting that's going to happen. It's going to be, that one's going to be a bit of an interesting one. Obviously, these things are stage managed to some extent, but lots of countries going to be recognising Palestine. I think the new Syrian president, will be there for the first time addressing the GA, which is going to be interesting as well. Ex-jihadist turned, poster boy for Mr. Trump. So lots of interesting things to happen, but this will absolutely dominate. So Mohammed, what is going on in a nutshell with all these countries recognizing the Palestinian state? It's a flurry of late, isn't it?
It is, and I find it's always interesting when we're looking at this context of the West taking certain stances and then how we interpret it. And sort of like you said, an important focus for us is how we respond as a Muslim community. The West, the world powers will always do what they do. My focus personally is how do we interpret that? How do we respond? Because that's where we built from, essentially. They'll always plot and they'll plan. How we respond is the important thing for us. And obviously we see the context that the genocide is ongoing and there's this pressure on all of these Western nations to do something by their people. Like in Australia, we had, the largest ever anti-war protests in the country's history, 300,000+ marching on the Harbour Bridge. That sends some sort of shockwaves. And it forces you as, whoever it is in power, whether you're talking about here in Australia or elsewhere, it forces you to take some sort of a stance and try to ease some of those tensions that are rising and occurring within society. And it's in this context, I think, that we're seeing all of these things. The genocide goes on. It does not stop. People aren't happy with this happening and staying silent, and they're trying to force some sort of questions from their governments. The two-state or the Palestinian state idea is not a new one. It's an old one. And I think one of the things we want to touch on is the history.
Yes.
And sort of how we've gotten here. Because it's definitely not a new thing. One of the questions they always ask is, well, why now?
Yeah.
And it's not a now thing. We've been asking why now for the past 80 years. Before the Zionist entity, the State of Israel, was even established in 1948, there were already discussions about a Palestinian state and how and when and what does a Palestinian look like. This has been a long discussion that continues until now. But every single time they bring it up, somehow, somewhere deep down, Muslims especially get this feeling that, well, we've made some sort of progress.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, the discussion needs to be, is really understanding this history.
So to frame it in the present moment, then, who are the countries that have that are going to do this recognition?
So most recently, I think France, the UK, Canada, Australia have been the largest ones who've come out and taken this stance.
Spain, Ireland, Norway, apparently as well.
And then and Spain and Ireland have sort of been taking a bit more of a pro-Palestine stance for
some
a
time.
year and a half or so. But these big, the UK, Britain, France, that's the symbolism of the entire West.
Security Council members
exactly,
as well.
Right. So that sends a massive statement in some ways.
Yep.
And I think it's important that we actually, sometimes the first instinct is, this is great, this is positive. It's a Palestinian state. How can we not be positive about this? We see the thank you statements that came out from within our community to Albanese, to the Labour Party for fulfilling your election promise and for recognising a Palestinian state. And a lot of this is because we don't understand the history and we don't understand the politics that's playing out, because our ummah has been so colonised, so secularised, that we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about the politics until somebody else is doing the politics and we're just reacting. We don't have our own standard. We don't have our own analysis that we're forming.
Well, I guess that's what we're here to do, and you're going to help us. You're going to help us do that. So, I mean, I think the key thing that we have to note is, to start with, this is happening during one of probably the worst phase of a genocide, of which there have been very few in the last 100 years. Like, for the term genocide to gain such wide currency that it's almost universally accepted now, including by many Israelis themselves, including by many, many people in America. You've got the right wing of America who hates Muslims and Islam, right? And probably Palestinians, they're associated with Islam as terrorists and so forth, almost flipping on a dime in the last, I would say, 6 to 12 months, right? And especially the last few months, we were discussing how crazy it is to see some of these figures who now are vehemently anti-Israel, right? Like it's like the pressure cooker has burst open, right? And so all of this, the idea of this being a genocide has got universal currency. Why would they want to recognize a state in the middle of a genocide when in the West Bank, the situation is so parlous with the settlements and how brazen they've become, right? And in Gaza, there is literally no territory left to talk about. Like it's uninhabitable. It's like a desert or Antarctica or whatever. Like, what are they recognizing? So what is the idea behind recognizing a state in the middle of a genocide? What's going on?
I think we need to understand the psyche of the West and what they're after. The history of the West, colonialism, imperialism is part and parcel of Western identity. It's not a anomaly, a blip that happened through the 1800s and that we've now resolved and trying to work our way through. It is part and parcel of it's part of the identity, the core identity of the West. So any of the actions that we see happening in our lands, we should not be fooled into thinking that it's part of some sort of, moral stance that they're taking, human rights, international justice, whatever it is. That's not what this is about, right? They're not doing this because it is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
They're doing this because, whenever we see them doing anything in the Middle East or in the Muslim world in particular, the way that I always frame it is that they want to preserve their interests, whatever that might be, with as little backlash as possible. So either they're doing something because this is the best thing for their interests, or perhaps they take a step back because they're worried about some level of backlash. And that's all it is. Whatever issue that you want to...
So that's how you would frame it?
Absolutely.
That's the framework in which you have to see it, in your view?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no other stance.
It's not because they're nice people.
The British founded the occupying state. They occupied Palestine. They handed it over to the Jewish settlers, right? They haven't somehow just, woken up one day 80 years later in the middle of genocide and be like, well, this is bad. If they had, they would take more concrete steps. We talked about Anas Sharif, rahmatullah alayh, being assassinated, right? It is very likely that the rocket that was fired at the Al Jazeera tent was from an F-35 that had Australian parts. Australia has not stopped any of its exports, any of its trade with the Zionist entity.
Yeah.
It is very likely that the intelligence they had on where these reporters are was from the British drones that fly 24 hours almost, day in, day out, over Gaza to obtain intelligence of what's happening on the ground, then hand it over to the Zionists and then carry out the genocide. They're not doing this because they have some sort of moral sense. If they did, they would stop the practical things that enable this genocide to keep on going, rather than taking these stances that really mean nothing on the ground.
So you're basically saying that it's never about principle. It's never about doing the right thing. I think everyone understands that. States have permanent interests, no permanent friends, and so far as the saying goes. So they want to, firstly, maximize interests. Secondly, minimize backlash. And so you would say that's the framework we look at it through. And so what we should try and do in today's episode then is to really understand the history and where we are, the present, in a trajectory of some sorts that gets us to understanding reality in light of that.
Absolutely.
Right? So I'm going to hold you to that. Challenge. So let's see if we can unpeel it a little bit. So let's talk about the history then. And I'm going to take us all the way back. Right? I'm going to take us quite a way back because so that's what's happening in the middle of a genocide. Right? You're going to sort of recognize a state where a state barely exists in real terms. Actually, before we go back to this, let's just talk about that for a second. Right? I just find it an absurdity. Right. And I think it's worth pausing on and discussing this idea. What is a state? And there's actually been a lot of discussion in the last few days about what is the concept of a state. There's a Montevideo convention. Montevideo is the capital of Uruguay, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken, or a city in Uruguay. And this is a famous sort of convention that happened in the 1930s or whatever that defined what a state is, right? And that's because many states actually don't recognize other states. And in fact, the number of countries in the world is not agreed upon. It's not even by the United Nations, right? Because countries like South Sudan, Kosovo, et cetera, are not necessarily recognized universally by everyone as states. And indeed, Palestine is the best example, right? And so there's these definitions, there's these sort of like parameters of what a state is that it has to fulfill. By that convention, Palestine, or the current Palestinian territory, could not possibly meet most of those parameters because it is literally a broken place. So what are they trying to, like, when that is the case, and when you realize how hard they work to make sure that not just anyone can declare a place a state, because it gives rise to all sorts of revolutionary movements that want to claim certain territory, right? When you keep that in mind, how hard the international order works to stop anything being recognized as a state unless it really meets their so-called definition, then I think you start realizing there's something more to it than that. Absolutely. There really is something. You've got to unpeel it. Like, and if you don't, and if you just sort of, as Muslims especially, it's like, what is going on here for 60, 70, 50 years, let's say, right? Since the idea of Palestinian sovereignty started gaining traction, they have refused. Arguably in better times, when there was a functioning government in Gaza, there was a functioning government in the West Bank, right? And they refused at that time. Now, when they've literally just blown it to smithereens, why would they do that? That's something I think that's been playing on my mind. What would you comment on that?
The definition of a state is really the interesting part. You talked about the Montevideo definition. The way I see it practically, like, Montevideo has there's 4, I think, key points. Yes. There's a Weber definition, which I find practically speaking is a lot more applicable to any state. And it says that basically a state is a community that can claim monopoly of legitimate use of physical force in a given territory.
That's right.
And physical force is necessary because you can't maintain order within a society without sort of, there's police, there's government, there's army, whatever
borders,
it is that
all those
maintains
sorts of things,
some sort of physical threat over the people to make sure that they comply with whatever rules internally as well as externally dealing with other states. You don't have any of that with Palestine. You have the PA, which essentially acts as a police or a security force on behalf of the occupiers.
Who can come in and out as they wish.
That's right. In Gaza, really, who has control on the ground? It's still Hamas. Even after 2 years of genocide, the people recognize that Hamas is their authority, right? When the aid comes in, even now there's sort of discussions about, and there's been some sort of rumors and some sort of talk coming out about, there's military, we've talked about this 2 weeks ago, that there are some tribes and there are some sort of armed rebels and so on that sort of take and steal some of this aid. It's Hamas that comes in and actually imposes some sort of authority to make sure that this doesn't happen, that the people are given access to the aid as they need to, using their weapons to protect the people as needed, using their weapons to stop any of the collaborators with the Zionist entity, right? And so when you talk about recognizing a state, they also know that this isn't practical because they say we'll recognize a state if they are disarmed, if Hamas is removed from authority, and we'll talk probably a bit more about
meaning they would never be able to meet even that plain English definition of what a state is.
It's fluff. It's fluff.
Which means that it's not about state recognition. Absolutely. It's got nothing to do with state recognition, right? And so I think if that is the starting point, then doing a historical analysis actually is very interesting because it gets you to why is this happening now and what is the objective? And I think with your framework in mind, I think by the end, let's circle back to it and see if we can sort of shed light on that issue. But I think this is a really, really important starting point, right? Because a lot of people, as you have said, have come out with this idea that, guys, it's progress. It's something. In this moment, let's take what we can have, right?
But whenever we say progress, the first thing that always pops into my head is Malcolm X.
Yeah.
That you don't call it progress when you put a knife 9 inches to my back and pull it out.
Yeah.
6 inches.
But
That's
I
not
think
progress.
it's a sign of the psyche of our people that we are so so enamored in our despondency that we can't see that. That we will take anything.
Absolutely.
Even when that, and really for me, it's like an apparition. It's a ghost. There's nothing there. When you actually look at what we've just discussed in terms of what a state is, they're not recognizing anything. It's absolutely symbolic. And what is that symbolism trying to achieve? I think that's what the history will tell us. So let's take it back. Yanni, you mentioned something interesting, which was that this is about colonialism. This is a colonial project, which is not over. And the era of colonialism did not end, right? And there's many people who unpeel this very, very well. It did not end. It changed forms, right? And today we're seeing a certain form of that. But let's go back into more classical colonialist times. And I want to start with the Ottoman era, right? Which is where the story really begins, and begins way before that. But Yanni, it becomes interesting in the modern era with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, or nearing the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Tell us very briefly about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, which are the two sort of foundational documents that anyone needs to understand this reality that we're in today.
I think the Ottoman era is very interesting because the response you always hear from Zionists is that Palestine never existed as a state, which is technically true to some extent. It was never its own autonomous state in the sense that we know of nation states today.
Yeah.
It existed as a territory within the Ottoman Empire. It had certain levels of autonomy. There was definitely a Palestinian identity as a nation of people, if you want, that goes back a few hundred years, right? Definitely very unique to even just sort of the greater Sham region, separate from sort of the Lebanese identity. There's a unique sort of set of people that have lived on this land that sort of had their own independent authority, because the Ottomans sort of very loose in how they police people within their territory. And then obviously we have, the division of our lands, colonialism, the British and the French come in, World War I, the Ottomans lose a lot of power. And then on the back of that, we have the Balfour Declaration, which is really the start of sort of the occupation story. And it's interesting that when we look at Balfour Declaration, it was always, a land without a people for a people without a land. And there's this promise that was given to the Jewish people that will give you a national home. Yep. Palestinian people are essentially not mentioned throughout the Balfour Declaration. Yep. Really, its main purpose was to just gain Jewish support for this war effort, right? And secure British influence over this land. They can achieve a number of interests, both internally within Europe and then the interests within the Middle East, by taking over this land and promising to eventually hand it over to the Jews. Yep. Like I said, they don't mention in there specifics and details of what this Jewish state will look like, or what happens to the Palestinian people. Yep. They say it's a land without a people.
Some generic reference about they should not be harmed or something. That's
right. So, but you don't need to think about like the Palestinian state, because you've essentially ruled them out as people that deserve a state. And this is where we see, like I said, you have your plan. They have their plan of what they want to achieve and their objectives and their interests, but then there's little resistance as possible. And so then they try to impose this over the decades. They bring in Jewish settlers who come on boats. Some of them are welcome, some of them are not.
That had started even before,
Absolutely.
in truth. With the Zionist Congress and
1880s, they started slowly migrating. And generally speaking, there weren't major tensions. And then we see when the British come in, obviously there's fight back against them. Yeah. We know the famous stories, Izzeddin Qassam, for example, and many other revolutionaries who fought back. And then this
in the 20s, Yanni.
Climaxes, absolutely. Through the 20s, climaxes at about 1936 to 1939, we have what they call the Arab Revolt. Yeah. And even the terminology shows you just how they've sort of framed this. Like, we have authority and the Arabs are revolting against us. It's a very Orientalist mindset.
But to get to the British mandate, to get to that point, the 30s, the 36 to 39 period, let's go back to the second document. So we talked about Balfour. Let's talk about the Sykes-Picot document, because that's equally as, if not more important, in many ways, to our greater Muslim being in the modern world. What was the Sykes-Picot agreement?
It's the British and the French divided these lands. They drew with their rulers. You literally see some of these straight lines, and they handed over. They divided it between themselves. The French took over Syria, the French took over Lebanon, the British took over Jordan, and then
Bahrain,
Palestine and Bahrain, so on different lands that they sort of divided between themselves. Sykes-Picot Agreement, and they established these nation states, which over the coming decades, or the prior decades, some of them were given their sort of independence, where they had their rulers that were elected or they were appointed,
or a mandate in certain cases,
and the mandates in certain cases. And Palestine is one of the classic examples of that, where this border was drawn. And the British took over as a British mandate over Palestine.
Which just means it's a fancy way of saying control, right? We will temporarily control that place, unlike the independent states where they were given independence and like, all right, you run it. But again, puppets were installed, very subservient sort of client states, if you will, because no one really had any real independence at that point.
That's right.
So we've got that. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement sets up the modern Arab world as we know it. The Balfour Declaration promises Israel, or modern day Israel, to the Jews, the Jewish state to the Jews, right? And then what happens? So you talk about the Arab Revolt, you talked about, so we're at that point.
And this is the key part where discussions about a Palestinian state first start.
Yes.
We talk about how these guys occupied our lands, they colonized us, and you realize they weren't that smart. That you think you can come to a land with however many million people and just hand it over to an occupying, colonizing, set of settlers who have far lower numbers than the natives on the land. And then it took them, 20 years until 1937, 20 years after the Balfour Declaration, when in the middle of sort of this, the Arab Revolt, that they finally actually had their first sit down where they say, what are we doing with these Palestinian people? And that's where, they said, we're going to unpeel this. This is where they had the Peel Commission.
Yes.
Where
basically after a couple of these really violent skirmishes and tit for tat battles, as it were, the British government sort of convenes a report and says, we need to figure out a solution to this problem, right?
That's right. They recognize that we can't just get rid of these people, right? And we've actually got a conundrum. What do we do with them? And this is the first time they start talking about a Arab state. They say it's irreconcilable that we have these Jews and we have these Arabs. We need to somehow divide them. So then they said, okay, let's divide it. Let's give it Palestinian and an Arab state, which is sort of on the Jordanian side, and there's a border between. And they said we'll give the Jews 20% of the land, and that was the first time this is ever discussed. So, like I said, we speak about why now. 1937, 11 years before the UN partition, they're talking about maybe we'll give the Palestinians a state. So this is a very long conundrum, a very old problem. And they started talking about, population transfers and, we give some of the land to these guys, some of the land to those guys, we swap over and Jews in this land, Arabs in this land. And obviously the Palestinians rejected.
So what happened? It was meant to be 20%. There was meant to be a Palestinian state. What took place in the late 1930s that changed the world and flipped everything on its head?
World War II.
Yep.
1933 is when we first started seeing massive Jewish migration towards Palestine. Obviously, once Hitler took power and there was this rising anti-Semitism in Europe, a lot moved to America, many moved to Australia. We have very long-standing Jewish communities in Australia, and then many moved to the Middle East and they sort of settled in Palestine. And World War II sort of rises up. And I just want to say as well, 1937 we had the Peel Commission, 1939, again, as little resistance as possible. Still the Arabs weren't accepting, the Palestinians weren't accepting this proposal, take 80% of the country, we're only going to give 20% of the Jews. So then they went even further, the British. 1939, they had what they called the White Paper, right? And it was actually quite strict against the Jews. They've never accepted something like this today.
Well, keep in mind, by this point, the British aren't just sort of struggling against the Arabs who are angry. The Jews are actually, and the Jewish migrants who are now in the territory, in the modern day Israel, are actually being very militant. Right?
And against the British as well.
And against the British. So they see the British as occupiers who are standing in the way of them claiming what is rightfully theirs. And so there's all sorts of literally terrorism going on by, what are the forerunners of the modern IDF, right? These Irgun gangs and these other sort of armed militant groups, Jewish groups, who are literally sabotaging British military installments, and of course culminates in the bombing of the King David Hotel, which was a very iconic event, isn't it, in some ways?
Yeah, and that was a few years later.
Yes, indeed. But it's just building up.
Absolutely. And then obviously they had massive issues within Europe and so on, and they're trying to juggle a lot at once. And, they say, all right, let's try to get this problem off our hands. Let's promise to the Palestinians, look, we're going to put severe limitations on how many Jews can migrate. We're going to restrict Jewish land purchases. And then within 10 years, we're going to give you an independent Palestinian state. 1939, they made that promise. Right? Again, this is nothing new. They've been doing this for ages. Ongoing conflicts throughout the 40s. King David Hotel bombed, terrorist attack, literally foundation of terrorism by the Zionist settlers. And then that leads us to the UN resolution.
Well, just before we get there, I think what supposedly in the historical narrative sort of really changes everything is the realization of the horrors of the Holocaust. So we are told in history, in terms of the trajectory, right? In terms of the facts and events. So, and I think they all knew, to be honest, what was going on. I find this notion that they did not know what was happening within Germany absolutely bonkers. I think they knew what was going on. But let's just follow the narrative, which is that this all comes to light magically. They weren't aware that this was happening behind German lines, but they all magically discover that this is going on. And again, my suggestion is not that it didn't happen, far from. It's the opposite. It's that they knew it was happening, right? They didn't do anything. They don't.
Same as we talked about Palestine.
100%.
They don't do this out of any
100%.
moral stance that we need to support the
That's
Jews,
right.
support the
They
Palestinians.
did not care about the Jews that were being killed, right? America did not care. Britain did not care. They knew this was happening. There's absolutely no way, because the Jews were complaining for so many years about the rising anti-Semitism within Germany. And as if they did not know that their relatives are in concentration camps and so on and so forth. It's absurd, the idea that they didn't know, right? So they let it happen, or they went along with it. Maybe they didn't understand the true extent, goodness knows. But, all this comes to light after the, the liberation of Germany by Russian forces and so forth. And in the coming years, now it's like, all right, mate, that's it. This is horrible. What's happened in Europe, it is absolutely tragic. And we need to give these people their state ASAP. And so within 2 years, between 45, the end of the Second World War, and 47, the partition plan comes to be. And now it is tilted very heavily in the side of Israel as a result.
The partition itself.
Yes, the partition.
Numbers were still very much not in
Yeah.
their favor. 1.5 million Palestinians, 650,000 Jews. Palestinians own 93% of the land. Jews only own 7% of the land. And then at this point,
At that point, or as part of the partition plan?
1948. No, at that point. 1947, before the partition.
Yeah.
In terms of on the ground, what was happening.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, Britain couldn't solve this problem.
Yeah.
They couldn't give the Jews what they had promised them.
Yeah.
So they said, let's defer this to a higher authority.
Yeah.
United Nations come in and save us, and the United Nations always functioned as another wing, another arm of the colonial entities and their plot to take whatever control they can over the world. And so the UN comes in 1947 and they divide this land.
Yep.
And they give, I think it's 48% and 52% the way they divide it essentially.
That's where the
50-50.
percentage changes in the.
That's right.
Yeah.
55% to the Jews and 45% to the Arabs. And there's a bit of a land corridor between the West Bank and the Gaza.
Yep.
And then the rest is given to the settlers.
Yeah.
This is, a partition plan that was given, recognizing a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Palestinians said, no, this is not our country.
Yeah.
The whole thing is ours.
Yeah.
And that's been the stance for the past 100 years, right?
Yeah.
They kept on going. This goes on 40s, 50s, 60s, ongoing clashes, skirmishes on the ground. There's no agreement. And then we get to 1967, Six-Day War. And that's really a crucial part in this whole discussion, because we always talk about the Green Line, the pre-1967 borders. 1967, the Arab nations come in. There's what I would call a staged war.
I mean, even in 1947, the War of Liberation or Independence, as they call it, right? So what happens then? Just if we can take a step back, just back to that point. So independence is declared, right? Independence is declared. There's that famous photo of Ben Gurion with the flag in the background and all that sort of stuff. And then there's a fight between the Arab states and and Israel. And in that process, many people are expelled, and that's the Nakba.
That's right, the Nakba.
And that's very, very important.
Exactly. And the number of Arab countries that supposedly sent their troops. And it's important to recognize, as we were talking about earlier, all of these Arab countries were formed through the Sykes-Picot agreement, arrangement. The rulers were imposed upon them. Some of them sent troops and armies, and even we had planes, that sort of Bengali, jets, and sort of fighting Pakistan at the time. I think East Pakistan.
Indeed.
But there was a fight.
Yeah.
And it lasted for a while, and then this war, and then the war ends.
Yep.
We have 15th of May. We have the Nakba. 750,000 of the Palestinians are expelled from their land. It's a huge number. Thousands that were killed. 500 villages destroyed. There were 50 recorded massacres, meaning dozens to hundreds of people that were killed. And by the end of this war, it's a bloody history. It's not like the land was just given to them. They fought, they killed, they massacred, they genocided. The Arabs and the surrounding nations pretended to put up a fight, right? There was no real battle. There was no real exertion of force or effort that they had capacity for. And then by the end of it, Palestinians have lost their land. The majority of them that left, of those 750,000, left of their own accord, you can say, in the fact that they were forced out, but they weren't sort of, or they were told, leave your houses, there's a war breaking out, and then you're going to come back and it's going to be liberated. So they go home with they walk out with their keys, they go towards the West Bank, they go towards Gaza, many of them, many go towards Lebanon, towards Jordan, Syria, Egypt, surrounding countries. They go with their keys, they go with their backpacks, they go with their families, literally on foot or on car or on horseback or donkey or whatever else that they had, and they never come back.
Yeah.
Their land's taken. The UN partition is the culmination of all of these efforts of this genocide. And we talk about today, they say that we can't reward Hamas by granting a Palestinian state. The Zionists were rewarded for their massacres by granting them the Israeli state. That's literally what they've done. And now they claim, they use a reverse claim. And as they say, every accusation is an admission when it comes to the Zionists.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So, and then let's fast forward to 67 and 73. Quickly go through that. So these wars that happen, supposed wars.
6-day war.
Yeah.
That tells you all that you need to know.
Yeah.
Jordan, Syria, Egypt, they send their troops, and without going sort of too much of the detail, because I know it's not our focus for today,
Yeah.
but there's a war. There are certain victories that are happening on the ground from these surrounding armies, and then they're told by the commanders stop advancing. In some cases, there's records of Egyptian government collaborating with Mossad, telling them, look, our troops are advancing, they're not responding to us, telling them to stop, and then
Their positions are
IOF
bombed.
goes
Yeah.
and bombs them.
Yeah.
Right, literally collaborating to make sure that there's no military advancement. It was a staged war to achieve a political goal, which is the formation of the borders, so-called, of the Zionist entity of the Israeli state. And then they agree, look, let's give back what was occupied after 1967. Let's give back the West Bank, right? And then sort of there's obviously Transjordan or Jordan sort of takes over part of it. They give back Sinai to Egypt. The Golden Heights remains a disputed area.
Yes.
And we have these borders that are then drawn on. We have a UN resolution, and then they decide that, okay, let's draw the borders here.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, the Zionists never agreed to drawing any borders. To this day, Israel does not have any recognized borders. They refuse to recognize their own borders because they have a continual expansionist ideology to build, at least from the river to the sea, if not a greater Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates. So they've never accepted any borders, despite all of these agreements or all of these offers that are made for them.
And that is the Greater Israel Plan that we've discussed previously on a previous podcast, but very, very relevant. So these wars happen, 67 happens, 73 happens, and then what? Where do the political sort of developments that have happened in the decades since fit in? Because there are no more explicit wars between, certainly the Arab nations have all become servile, right? In fact, I think it's worth going very quickly through each of the Arab nations, right? What's going on? So let's start with Egypt. What happened to Egypt? After 73.
Egypt normalized soon after 73. Camp David. Anwar Sadat gives the first ever speech by an Arab leader inside the Israeli Knesset, a very historic moment. And one of the greatest instances of betrayal known in the history of this entire conflict.
And since then, Egypt has really been completely mute.
Right now, their own border with Rafah, they say we can't do anything because we have the Camp David agreement. It's always been, that's their line since then, right? We had Mubarak who did nothing for 30 years. We had obviously the revolution. Morsi took power for a year or two, and there was a lot of obviously
aid
passion and
strong
strong words and opening of these borders and sort of aid going through and different groups sort of entering in. And it was a time that Egypt was very volatile and trying to build their state, and they never advanced further than that. Morsi is replaced. Sisi comes in, and Sisi acts as a Zionist agent, as a protector on their border for the past decade.
So Egypt is completely neutered, basically.
Absolutely.
So that's Egypt. What about Jordan?
Jordan was created in the first. Jordan does not exist historically. If you go back 100, 200 years, you will not find the word
sham
Jordan
of a country, basically.
in any map, in any atlas, in any dictionary, in any thesaurus. It does not exist. It was literally created by the British as a buffer to protect the borders of this Jewish entity that they're creating. That was literally its purpose. They part of it was also to reward, the Hashemite family, put them in power and grant them a country of their own.
They were the ones. They were one of the ones who, for our viewers, they were one of the ones who agreed with the British to revolt against the Ottomans.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and they're given their state, and
but Jordan is a real embarrassment of a country, I have to say. No offense to any Jordanians, it really is embarrassing if you're from Jordan. It's like, where are you even from, bro? That place does not exist. I don't mean that seriously, but yes, it is really
served
sad.
that purpose for ages.
Really sad. Yeah.
More recently, they've over the past decade or so, they've removed all of the families and completely cleared out the region which borders with Zionist lands, right, occupied territories, to make sure that there is no possibility of anybody infiltrating across this border. They control the King Hussein Bridge, like their lives depend on it, to make sure that nobody crosses over. That's any threat or harm to the Zionists. They are harsher than the Zionists and allowing people to enter in sometimes. So literally, again, acts as a police state, as a protector for the Zionists.
Then we've got Lebanon. What would we say about Lebanon?
Lebanon's a small country. Lebanon's a small state. It's very divided internally. A lot of religious sectarian differences, which always has been, and that's been weaponized by the colonizers as much as possible. Going back to the time of the Ottomans, and where they sort of backed certain groups, whether it was certain sects or certain religions, and they backed them against each other, and they sort of instigated certain divisions, 100%. And then that's led to
vicious civil war.
Absolutely, civil war. And Lebanon has a lot less subservience historically to the West in the same way that sort of Egypt and Jordan do.
Yes,
in that
absolutely.
People on the ground have a lot more freedom. So we've seen a lot more resistance efforts within there. Palestinian, refugees or people who've sort of moved to Lebanon who've led
the
revolutionary
PLO
groups.
story was a very famous.
That's right. Hezbollah has a long history and sort of that clash sort of on the border. But again, there's sort of we have a long history. We have the 1993 war. We have Sabra Shatila. We have 2006 war. So there's always been a conflict on that line. And right now, it seems that they're trying to just wipe that out for a final time.
Remarkable job in the last 2 years.
Hezbollah's arms in the fact that they're the only sign of resistance in Lebanon. Take their arms. Let the Lebanese army function like the Jordanian and the Egyptian armies do, as just another protector for the Zionists.
And last but not least, Syria.
What
do we say about Syria?
Who do you start with Syria? Syria, I think, again, sort of...
Syria is possibly the most interesting of the lot, isn't it?
Definitely.
Because from 73, when there was this really awkward agreement about the Golan Heights, right? There's been like this weird state of stalemate where officially both states are, in a state of war against each other, almost, right? I mean, there's some sort of like...
They both claim the Golan Heights.
Both claim, yeah.
Absolutely.
And Syria has always postured as a part of the resistance against it, like the strong, far more so than Egypt, Jordan, any of these, like in an active state of almost conflict.
Even as far back as last year, when there was one of the Arab League summits in early 2024.
Before the fall of Bashar.
And Bashar al-Assad was invited when he was sort of
being normalized
within the Arab League. He gave one of the strongest speeches, possibly the strongest speech on that day. Fire and passion about resistance and fighting back and where's our Arabness and and that was their posture to the public for decades, right? Axis of resistance, we fight, and but on the ground, like you said, there's nothing.
That's right, and I mean the Golan Heights were probably the clearest example of how much they accepted the status quo and were quite happy with the status quo, to be completely frank, right? I think, in fairness, and of course we've talked about Syria separately, we have to recognize this, that when Iran was trying to sort of impose its idea of the Shiite crescent, right, that Syria was a thoroughfare for weapons, etc., through its territory to Lebanon and to Hezbollah as part of the axis of resistance. Now, of course, there's many contradictions with this axis of resistance. There's an episode that we need to do at some point just on that. But it is worth acknowledging that Syria played that role. But there's also, I think, a very, very dark reality where, there's like a greater common enemy almost, it felt at times. And that, of course, ended up being the uprising that took place. And it sometimes felt, certainly towards the end of Bashar's time, that there was a common interest with Israel in sort of destroying any capability or capacity that this emerging Sunni threat may have. And so we saw what we saw towards the end, which is that the coordinates were handed over to Israel, and they bombed Syria back to the Stone Ages almost.
Yeah, that's right. And throughout the entire period, 30 or 40, since 1973, I think, there has not been a single Zionist soldier killed or even attacked by a Syrian
soldier. Not even a shot fired, I heard.
Until 2025 in Nawa, when the Zionist enters on the ground and they try to sort of storm some of the Syrian cities, and they've had Syrian forces on the ground actually fighting back, and reports of some injured and killed, was the first time that we have reports of Zionist soldiers injured by Syrians after Bashar's entire time.
Incredible. 1973, it's like 50 years or something. It's nuts, absolutely insane. So those are the Arab states, right? And it's in that context then let's go back to the discussion that we were having regarding Egypt, because I think that's important, right? The Camp David Accords, right? They are seen as this really, really seminal moment between Egypt and Israel. It's widely celebrated in the West as like this sign of peace and so on and so forth. Tell us about that a little bit. What's the significance of that?
It was the first time that one of the Arab countries or one of the Muslim countries recognized the right of Israel to exist. Like I said, after 1967 is where we had this expansion of the Zionist borders or the occupied borders, and they took Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, and then as part of the Camp David Agreement, we take back Sinai and we recognize your right to exist. So no longer was the focus on the Palestinian people, on their right to statehood, which will be relevant. We'll talk about the Abraham Accords, which is just an extension of that. And we'll talk about statehood as just one element of it, but no longer about their right to resistance, no longer about supporting the liberation of Palestine. We now recognize that Israel is a state that exists with these borders, essentially 55 to 78%, or at this point, 78% of historic Palestine. And so it's hugely historic for that reason.
And then what happens through the 80s and 90s? I know we're skipping entire decades very quickly, but it's important.
89 was the first Intifada.
Yes.
And the Palestinian people rose and revolted for the first time since 67 in mass numbers, armed militias, small groups, that then started fighting back, especially from the West Bank, and that caused a lot of headaches for the Zionists.
And this was in response to certain skirmishes and triggers. There were specific events that happened that led to that. Just one thing after another led to this sort of fighting happening.
That's right. That's right. And at the end of the day, 2,000 civilians were killed during that period of time. The PLO was probably the major player
force,
at that time, the major resistance force. And again, it's how these political processes always come about. We always talk about Oslo. And Oslo is where, one of the most historic moments, one of the key moments when we talk about the recognition of Palestine as a state. Oslo Accords, 1993.
So, important to note, Oslo follows the Second Intifada, right?
First Intifada.
Sorry, the First Intifada, my bad. Straight after. So it's a response to it in some way. So you resist, you fight, and then they say, let's bring you all together and talk.
It's a direct response. Yeah. It's to say that, look, you guys have been fighting. Let's sit down and let's stop what's happening on the ground. Again, going back to what we said, they have their interests, but with as little resistance as possible. So where there's some resistance, let's bring them to the table. Let's have this discussion. Let's offer them a pathway towards recognizing a state, right? Which is basically what we're getting today from Australia and the UK and Canada and France and so on, is that we'll say, we'll recognize a state if you meet these conditions. It's exactly what they did in Oslo. If you recognize our right to exist in peace, if you renounce terrorism, right, then we'll accept the PLO as the representatives of the Palestinian people and we'll work on a pathway towards the recognition of the Palestinians. Of the Palestinian state. And that's what they accepted. Right. The PLO succumbs, the PLO accepts. Yasser Arafat we'll talk about in a moment because I want to come back to him and talk about the two-state solution and why it's dead. But this happens. Yasser Arafat is hailed as a hero for the resistance efforts, but then also internally, sometimes for the Oslo Agreement at the time, especially because you found a way towards peace, supposedly, right? And we see this pathway, the Madrid conference and so on.
But he's also declared a traitor by a fair part of the Palestinian people.
Especially as time has gone on.
Yes.
Especially as time has gone on. Because the Oslo Agreement was one of the biggest backstabs in Palestinian history. Is that there was a strong resistance front that was completely wiped out for these political processes that only existed to prevent any resistance, to demilitarize. And what we saw after Oslo immediately, the PLO is integrated, now becomes a Palestinian authority.
Yes.
And Fatah now uses their weapons and their authority to wipe out all resistance efforts on the ground. Many of the resistance fighters who have been in prison for 30 plus years since then, or that at least served decades and were released recently, most significantly post-October 7 with the prisoner exchanges, they spent decades in prison because of their terrorism, right? The terrorism was renounced in the Oslo Agreement. They made sure that they took people's arms away and they imposed a police authority, the Sulta, or the PA, over the West Bank, and their primary function was to work as a security agency on behalf of the Zionists. And what we've seen today in the West Bank, which we'll come to in a moment, is exactly a representation of what a Palestinian state would look like. Oslo showed us what that looks like, right? And so this goes on for a while. There's these growing tensions. People aren't happy with what's happening. We have the famous incident where Sharon goes to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the Second Intifada rises.
That's 1999.
Yeah, and in 2000 we have the Second Intifada, 5,000 civilians are killed, and eventually that's shut down with sort of these more political proceedings. Promises.
That's where the Arab peace agreement, the Arab peace process, or whatever it's called, the
Arab Peace Initiative.
Yes, the Arab Peace Initiative. Yeah, they have this one is a very generically named one. Most of them have funky names. Yeah.
Arab Peace Initiative, 2002. So straight off the back of the Second Intifada, 22 Arab states, including Palestinian Authority, all come together. Some of them in person, some of them agreed to this later on, and they agreed to this set of conditions. I think 4 key conditions, and what they agreed upon was a full Israeli withdrawal from all territories occupied since 1967, so the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and Sinai, right, which had already been returned to Egypt. The second was a recognition of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as capital. Again, it's nothing new. Thirdly, a just solution for the Palestinian refugees, so some sort of right of return or compensation. And then the fourth, in return, we will normalize relations with Israel. And again, political process to shut down armed resistance. What have we seen in the past 20 years? Except further division, further neutralization of Palestinian states, if you want to call it that, of the Palestinian people, of Palestinian resistance, and of the broader Middle East and Arab people. This is what we saw, and that went on for, that's been the status quo for that period of time. And I think the most significant thing that's happened since then is 2020, end of Trump's sort of first era, is Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
And Trump hails himself as a hero.
And I mean, in that time, of course, a couple of other important things have happened. So I think the 2006 pullout from Gaza was a result of the Arab Peace Initiative, right? That was, as you just mentioned, one of the conditions of withdrawal from sort of occupied parts of the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip, which they did. They removed themselves from Gaza. Elections happened. Hamas came to power, right? Yes. That's, of course, a story in itself. Hamas came to power. And so now you've got a situation where you've got an Islamist government, right, in Gaza, although it's a small territory, but very heavily populated, right, densely populated. And in the West Bank, you've got the Palestinian Authority, right? And that then led to these four key, I wouldn't call them, I mean, not wars by any stretch of the imagination, but four key operations that have happened over that time. I think 2008, 11, 12, 14, and then
21.
And, that's right.
October 7, 2023.
Yeah. And let's then go back to what you were saying about the Abraham Accords, because Trump, who basically has the ego the size of America,
the deal of the century,
and fancied himself as the peacemaker in the Arab world, pushes this major program called the Abraham Accords. And what are the Abraham Accords?
To his credit, Trump did a massive job.
Yeah, he did. Very successful.
There's this famous photo which will never, you'll never leave your minds of Trump holding this orb with King Salman on one side and several of the other Arab leaders around him, and they're holding on to the top. And from there, the Abraham Accords were born. Yeah. And the key thing to note about the Abraham Accords is that all of these previous agreements and discussions and political processes that we've spoken about always had the condition of working towards or recognizing a Palestinian state in exchange for normalization. The Abraham Accords are the first time, and like I said, Camp David Accords to some extent, but the Abraham Accords especially is about establishing formal diplomatic relationships between these other surrounding states with Israel as a country. And the framing is that it's peace for peace rather than land for peace. The Palestinian state is not mentioned within it. It's that as long as you are peaceful towards us, we normalize relations, we recognize Israel as a state, we recognize your occupation. If they don't no longer use that term, we normalize trade relationships, diplomatic relationships, and we move on as if you are any other nation that exists within our midst. And that's the key difference with the Abraham Accords.
And I think really for that reason, it is seen as a huge betrayal by the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
That the entire Arab world, Ummah at large, but Arab world has completely sold us out.
And it started with the UAE and Bahrain, but then expanded to many other states.
Morocco, Saudi Arabia was next in line. Egypt was already done. Egypt was first cab off the rank.
And that's what led to October 7.
Yeah.
That's what led to October 7, is this this view, for better or for worse, right or wrong, however someone wants to frame it, right? Is that the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, felt that the world has forgotten us and our struggle. The Arabs have moved on and they're ready to normalize. And the Zionists will take this as an opportunity to come in and just wipe us out and take our land. So we need to plan some sort of a surprise attack or go in the offensive.
Yeah. So that's where we are, right? Broadly sort of speaking. Where were things headed? So would it be right to say that, pre-October 7, there really was a sense that even the two-state solution was gone, right? Like even would it be fair to say that Israel was so brazen that even it no longer entertained the idea? Because, I mean, we know that they don't want a two-state solution, right? And we'll get to that in a second. But would it be fair to say that even that was off the cards pre-October 7?
Look, I think it's hard to define. I think at the moment, I'd absolutely say that. The two-state solution is completely dead.
No, I'm talking about pre-October 7.
Pre-October 7, I'd say it was still very much part of the greater plan. And there were definitely massive, loud and growingly loud sections within Israeli society that were against any such, Palestinian state or so on. Right. And they were growing in size, growing in voice, growing in their strength, but not dead. And I would say they were the majority. Yeah. I think October 7 really shifted things and ensured that, the true emotions and the true identity of the Zionists has been revealed, and they will never accept the Palestinian state of any kind.
So then let's go to post-October 7, where we are right now, right? It's dead. The notion is dead, right? And I think this is when we look at the history and we come back now to what I said we would do, which is in the context of that framework that you mentioned before. Let's look at this now in light of that, right? Put yourself in the shoes of the Zionists in terms of what they're doing at the moment. For them, the idea of a functioning, able state that exists right next to them is complete anathema. They'll never accept
that has never been on the table, for the record.
Yeah, of course.
Previously, and like I say, when they sort of debate over a Palestinian state or not, do we accept a two-state solution or not, it was never on the table that this would be a functional Palestinian
Sure,
state.
sure.
It was always a Bantustan of a
that's right.
dysfunctional state that has no potential of doing anything.
Yep.
Right? And that we have control.
And now they won't
complete
accept
control
even
of.
that.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Now it's like everything is off.
I think their expansionist identity has increased.
Yep.
Gaza, they've announced that they want to completely occupy. They want to completely take over. And to me, what that means, and they still sort of tater on talking about some sort of Arab nations controlling. They say that we won't accept Hamas, and notably, they say we won't accept the Palestinian Authority. And this to me is the biggest evidence that two-state solution is that they call Mahmoud Abbas a extremist,
Yes, they do.
terrorist, Islamist. They don't trust him. This guy is your biggest asset.
Yep.
This guy nobody has done more than him to wipe out any resistance efforts in the West Bank. Nobody has done more than him to protect the Zionist entity internally. But to them, he's a traitor. We can't trust him to take control of Gaza because he's a Palestinian.
That's right.
So they won't accept any sort of. They want to occupy Gaza. They talk about Palestinian Authority won't accept them. Maybe some Arab nations doing some bits and pieces. Maybe implementing. They've actually just today come out with a plan where they've mentioned, and I'm just pulling up my note. Samir Halila, who they've just mentioned a couple of hours ago as someone who's being proposed by the Zionists as the new leader or the governor of Gaza post-war. And he's someone who has very, very strong ties to the PA. He's close friends with Bashar al-Masri, who's one of Donald Trump's close friends, Palestinian, American businessman.
Probably builds hotels or something.
Exactly. He's a real estate tycoon.
Yeah, right.
There's very close to power, close to the Zionists. He's been recommended by the Zionists, by Zionist lobbies as somebody to take control. But really, this is all just posturing. They want to take this land and make it just like the rest of the 1948 territories. They want to build Trump hotels.
Yep.
They want to take over and build their settlements. They already have the auctions where they auction off land in Gaza. So their plan is completely occupy all of Gaza. And in the West Bank, it's no different. They talk, again, at times like the West Bank is a separate land, but increasingly, their settlements are growing in Gaza.
Huge.
Pre-October 7, they were growing.
Yep.
Historic numbers, hundreds every single year. Their numbers are growing. They come in, they take land like it's theirs.
Yep.
So that there's no hope for any sort of Palestinian state within the West Bank. And then even beyond that, South Syria, they want control of, and they're taking control of in many ways. They weaponize the Druze, which was on one of the previous episodes. The south of Lebanon, I'm certain whatever happens with Hezbollah now, they'll try to take their weapons, and there might be some sort of resistance and some sort of political process to try to do this. But the plan
Well, it
is
could
to
become a
take
real flashpoint. There's talks of civil war in Lebanon over something like this.
And who knows how things. The one thing that we've learned over the past is that anything is possible.
Nothing.
But very clearly, the Zionist plan is that we take the south of Lebanon up to the Litani River, and we take that as our land. And then they've got the start of their greater Israel state, and they expand from there. There is no policy for a two-state solution.
So what's in it for the West here? We talked about how the West will behave a certain way based on that framework we discussed. Let's go back to that. So, what does the West get from saying, from recognizing, a Palestinian state when, and it's described like that, it's such a farce. I mean, it is actually insulting to the intelligence of a person that you will recognize a state where literally there is nothing. It's rubble.
Yeah.
So that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
So what those two things that you mentioned, number one, I think it was, dealing with the blowback, right? Dealing with, and some sort of strategic interest. So what's the strategic interest here?
I think the history tells us the answer. In that, when we look at the history of why a Palestinian state was even mentioned in the first place, it was the Arab revolt of the late 30s. The history of why the UN had to step in and propose some sort of a partition was because of the war and sort of the revolt from the Palestinian people on the ground, as well as the surrounding states leading to the Nakba. Why Camp David happened is because there was a war, and then they had to sort of provide some sort of political agreement.
So after each of these
Oslo was after the first
fights,
Intifada.
There's something. Yeah.
The Arab Peace Initiative was after the second Intifada. So whenever they see that there's resistance, we have to find some sort of way to neutralize that resistance.
Or to channel the energy almost, like dissipate the
That's right. And
the heat.
Look, I think the West has many interests in the Middle East, which we probably don't need to go into now, but obviously they have the interest in terms of trade routes through the Suez Canal and so on. They have the gas pipelines. They have the deals with sort of the Gulf countries and so on. They have obviously strategic interest in shutting out any ideologies that might grow that are opposing to them, right? And they want to make sure they achieve these. And Israel as an outpost is a key part of the strategy.
Yeah.
I don't think the West cares what the exact solution looks like, whether it's a two-state solution, whether it's an Israeli state, whether it's a greater Israel state. They don't care. They just want to achieve their interests in the Middle East. but they want to do that with as little resistance as possible. So when we talk about a two-state solution, which has been, the slogan for decades, America it's been their official line, and all of the rest of the Western countries, their official line has been a two-state solution, is what we're working towards, what we advocate for. The reason is because they know that if we say publicly, we support Israel taking all of Palestine from the river to the sea, they'll face some sort of backlash from the Palestinian people on the ground, but also stirring up emotions within the Arab and the Muslim people in surrounding countries. If you do this quietly, you do it silently, you have some sort of peace process, and then you take power like Oslo, the people stay quiet. But when you have massive things that are a shock to the system, people rise up and people ask questions. October 7 did that, not just within Palestine, but the surrounding countries. We still see this simmering, growing sort of tension in all of the surrounding countries, which eventually, I'm certain, will blow into something big.
And the world is up in arms in terms of the barbarity of what is going on.
Absolutely. So the two-state solution has always been a line that they've had to repeat and that they've constantly repeated because they recognize
these populations.
Absolutely. And we see this like even Ehud Olmert, one of the ex-Israeli presidents, he said the day that the two-state solution dies, it is over for us. Recognizing that if we don't parrot this line, if we don't go according to this procedure, do things slowly, accept some sort of borders, there will be blowback against us. I was listening to yesterday a podcast with Mort Stein, an American sort of Israeli rabbi. He has a lot of influence, meets with a lot of these American leaders and Israeli leaders. And he said a line which stuck with me. And I'm just trying to see if I've got it here. Essentially, he said that he speaks to many leaders of Israel. And he says that I told them that this is a religious war. This is an Arab Islamist war. This is an Islamic Quran-based war to kill the Jews, and that the Jews don't belong on our lands. So he says to them, why don't you say that? And they say to him, this is exactly what he said. They say to him that if you frame this as an Islamic war, there are 1.5 to 2 billion Muslims. It will be a nightmare for us. So they recognize, they know this in their mind. Like we can't advance a war against the Muslims. We can't. And historically, this has been the case. Like when they first came into our land in 1917, and they say that, we finally rescued Jerusalem from Muslim rule after 673 years, when they say the Crusaders have returned and so on, they were told by the British PM, don't use this language of the Crusaders because you'll instigate the emotions of the Muslims. So they want to silence this as much as possible. They don't want to use this sort of rhetoric to avoid inflaming, the rest of the Ummah. I think from that perspective, there's been this effort to try to sort of continue along the two-state solution rhetoric.
And that's where we are.
That's where we are.
That's the strategic interest, and that's the way of dissipating that. That's right. That heat.
I think an important thing to know is where America is at the moment, especially Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump doesn't care, and that he's happy to support Netanyahu and Israel doing what they do, as long as it doesn't cause too many problems for neighboring countries. Post October 7, Netanyahu and co have seen a golden opportunity for them to impose changes over the Middle East as much as they can, building the David Corridor, taking this land in South Syria and South Lebanon, like we sort of talked about, and beyond that. And this is a chance to make changes because everything they can justify by we're fighting terrorism, fighting Hamas, right? And so they can justify all of these things to the world, supposedly, to the mainstream media and so on. And so they use this to now change their rhetoric. And like I said, they've moved on from a two-state solution, publicly and privately. And so I think Trump is happy to accept this. He's happy to back them. When he's asked, what do you think of Netanyahu's plan to occupy all of Gaza? He says, I trust him, or it's not my business. He can do what he wants. So he doesn't push back.
But he's very sad about the kids that are on TV dying.
Supposedly. I see them on TV is what he says.
So sad.
So it frustrates you that these are the people that have influence over us.
Oh, it's incredible, right? It's incredible. So I guess what you're sort of saying is, in parts of the world, this is a dissipation of energy, right? This is an outlet for people.
That's right.
What about the idea that America and Europe have diverging interests, and so this pressure from European countries, France, UK, Ireland, Australia could fall into that sort of bucket, Spain, right? That this is a European thing, and they're pushing back against America, which is being very brazen. And sure, they'll say, I'm so sorry, but he will continue to arm to the teeth Israel.
That's right. I think there's always been a clash between Europe and America for power. post World War II. America previously was very isolationist, and then obviously finds a role for itself in the world as Europe is weakened, takes over a lot of these colonial projects, has massive influence over Europe through NATO. They are now, the protector of Europe militarily. Many European countries no longer spend on the military because they have America protecting them. And for many European nations, this doesn't sit well with them. They have their own ego and their own arrogance. They want to be the colonial powers of the world, especially France and Britain. And so then they look for these opportunities to push back against America. And Allah Azza wa tells us in the Quran that you see them as if they're united, but really they're divided, right? And I think that there's definitely an element of that internally.
Whether that could manifest into anything real is obviously a secondary issue, right?
Absolutely.
So even if they're fighting over symbols, which is the idea of Palestinian statehood, it's still a fight over symbols.
I think that's what it is. Like it's trying to gain that soft power in the world,
Yes.
To position themselves as a moral alternative to America's very brash arrogance and ego and so on. And it's not the first time that we see this sort of conflict. We see when it comes to even things like the West Bank settlements. The Europe has always taken a stronger stance than America has. When it comes to things like the Ukraine war now, as America, most famously when Trump and J.D. Vance gave Zelensky a massive talking down. The Europe took a very strong stance behind Zelensky.
That's right. And everyone came out within an hour. Like, oh, we're behind him, and all that sort of stuff.
And they came out very strongly when Trump first took power this time around. So I think especially Trump and the Republicans, they're a lot more sort of at odds with.
Well, yes, because they're enforcing on them a 5% budgetary, NATO spending sort of requirement. It's like pay or keep, or 4% or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think they're finding this as an opportunity to take back some of that
moral
authority.
But that's all it is.
Absolutely.
Right? And so for Muslims, seeing all this, right, let's bring it back to the point, which was how do we, and I want to sort of close up, I think we're about to hit our time. What do we as Muslims do here? How do we interpret this, right? When I look at the history that we've discussed, when I look at the reality on the ground that we've discussed, right, I actually, and it's not because I think anyone is ill-intended when they say this, right, but I actually think it is insulting to our brothers and sisters for what they are facing on the ground, for anyone to suggest that there can be anything, quote unquote, achieved, or it's a step towards anything for there to be a recognition of a Palestinian state. Like, it's insulting.
And we've sort of talked about it briefly, but I think it's worth just sort of saying specifically the conditions that they state.
Yes.
For what this Palestinian state will be.
Not that we care about the details here, but the details are even worse.
Because it shows you that they truly don't care. And it just demonstrates how insulting it is, as you're saying. As I said, they say that completely Hamas needs to be removed from all authority, for instance. And we can understand why they take that stance from the West, but you can understand why the Palestinian people will never accept that, especially in Gaza, right? They talk about demilitarization. Complete demilitarization, right? Having sort of police authority and security force, but no military presence whatsoever. And when we talked about definition of a state, I mentioned specifically you have to have...
It's complete madness.
Exactly. You have to have a physical authority over the people. You can't do that without a military.
It's actually madness.
Internally and externally. I've been trying to find it, but
they should say we're recognizing a Palestinian council or something like that.
I have a note recorded from 2020.
Local
council. I'm trying to find it. This was referring back to the ALP, and I believe it was a quote from Penny Wong, and I was trying to look for it the past couple of days, but I couldn't find it. But where the Australian Labor Party took a stance where they actually state that the borders between Palestine and Israel will be patrolled by Israeli military, and the borders between Palestine and neighbouring Arab states will also be patrolled by Israeli military. So you don't control any of your borders with any of your neighbouring states. Obviously, sort of like we said, completely sort of demilitarized, and even in their language, like the most significant, talk about Australia and the Labor Party, their most significant stance on this came in the 2015 National Conference, and where they've got sort of quite a detailed
position
that they've sort of, and like even their language that they use, in there was coming off the back of the 2014 war. They said that Hamas needs to stop all rocket attacks of Israel, and Israel needs to exercise maximum restraint. So you can see even in the permitting one side to have power and the other side to have none, right? And the way that they've been doing it is completely self-serving. Bob Carr came out, and Bob Carr was champion. He was at the front of this Harbour Bridge protest and so on. He came out with a tweet, and he said, the first thing they said about the ALP stance, congratulations to the Australian Labor Party, congratulations to Penny Wong, congratulations to Albanese. I've been campaigning for this since 2014. It's fully self-serving. Like, it's about themselves. They're patting themselves on the back that we've taken this stance. They don't care about the Palestinian people. And so when we come out and we start thanking them for doing this, we start congratulating them on doing this, it shows how insulting it is. And when you want to understand what this Palestinian state will look like, you just have to look at the West Bank today. The West Bank is not a state, right? And more these settlements occur, and they take some of our land and they impose themselves, and you can't do anything in response.
Yeah.
One of the key, I think, factors that explains it to me is when you look at resistance efforts, right? You compare Gaza today, which has been fighting as a Zionist for 2 years straight and doesn't show signs of relenting. They continue to deal massive blows to the occupying IOF terrorists. In the West Bank, they don't have that capacity because they've been neutralized by the PA.
Yeah.
Their weapons have been taken away. They try some sort of resistance efforts, like in Jenin. The Zionists came in and they wiped them out within a few days because you can't organize yourself.
Yeah.
Whereas in Gaza, we saw where they didn't have the same
20
PA.
years of preparation.
That's right. They did have the PA sort of stamped on them. They had the ability to sort of organize and prepare themselves and so on. When you talk about liberation of Palestine, this is not a path towards liberation of Palestine. Right. It is weakness.
I mean, I personally feel that anyone who goes down this path is not interested in the liberation of Palestine.
Absolutely.
And that's got to be something that we are willing and able to say as bluntly as that.
Absolutely.
Because anyone who accepts this framework of this sort of reality either they're very naive, and you can maybe give that excuse, like really, really naive to the point
And I'll
of
accept that from some people who have never had any exposure to any politics.
Sure.
Anyone who's supporting this is supporting the Zionist plot.
Yes.
To occupy lands.
Yep.
Plain and simple.
Yeah.
Like I said, Ehud Olmert said that the day the two-state solution dies, we are gone.
Yeah.
If you are supporting this, you are supporting Zionist occupation, direct or indirect, over Palestinian land, and the weakening of any potential for resistance to take back our land.
Just for a minute, let's entertain the idea.
Yes.
What do these people actually think? And, I'm talking about some of the people in our community, some of the mashayikh in our community who back this sort of stuff. What do they think this will achieve? Like, what is the mental gymnastics that goes on that leads to something from this? What is it?
The main thing that I've heard, and you could probably summarize it too, is let's at least achieve something, a base from where we can build, and then in the future, whatever happens, happens.
But that's not defined. It's not a future where we can strike back and fight back and take back what's ours.
Let's at least establish a state where we can govern ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think everything that we've talked about explains why that's it shows.
It's not even a pipe dream. It's like
It shows that you don't understand what the plan is.
Yeah.
That the West comes in and says, "Hey, I know you're upset. How about I give you a cookie to keep you silent?" And you say, "Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
This works. I'm happy as long as you've recognized me." That's all you want, just some sort of recognition. You don't want liberation. You don't want talk about self-determination. There's no true self-determination. You don't have any political ideas or plans of your own.
Absolutely.
You don't see any agency for the Ummah or for the Palestinians to do anything on their own.
And
so
you're
let's
willing to succumb.
accept what crumbs are given to us and do nothing.
And this really comes back to, and I want to close up, really, this is the choice that they made in Gaza, right? And I mean, you see it manifest in everything that they've done over the last 2 years, and even more, arguably, right? They chose a death of dignity over a life of humiliation. That's how you can summarize this entire sort of episode in a nutshell, right? That there are people who lived in an open-air prison for that long, and they made a choice. And yet people who have it so materially easy, have got everything in the world, are willing to, instead of using the freedom and the voice that they potentially have to, at least in principle, take, no one's asking you to pick up arms over here, right? At least speak with your voice for what is true. But instead of that, they choose humiliation. Like it's actually dumbfounding.
A couple of years ago, Australian Labour Party takes power. And in our community, we had massive iftars. We invited the Australian Labour Party. Our mashayikh stood there and told them, we hold you to your promise to recognize a Palestinian state. A year later, in October 2022, the ALP reversed a decision from the Liberal government to move the Australian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, saying, look, this is too extreme. Let's not rock the boat too much. Let's reverse the decision and keep the embassy in Tel Aviv. And we saw statements coming out from some of our mashayikh and communities and so on, congratulating the decision, saying that this is just, that we're moving away from occupied Jerusalem, as if Jaffa, Tel Aviv, is not occupied as well. And so on. So in October of 2022, we saw that the ALP reversed the decision from the previous government to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, saying this is rocking the boat too much, let's move it back to Tel Aviv. And it was at that point that I had a few discussions with people in the community. And I said, look, there's nothing to congratulate about a Palestinian state. And we were saying that's keep going with this momentum to recognize a Palestinian state. And I was told, stop speaking from your comfort in the West to, impose further oppression on the Palestinian people. Let's accept some respite for them. But it's the Palestinian people who are saying that we don't want this. We don't accept this. We would rather fight and die that death of dignity, as you said, than live that life of humiliation.
One of the most vivid memories of the last couple of years is, for me, one of the memories of the encampment, the University of Sydney encampment. There was a brother from Gaza, one of the refugees, who's exited and came to Australia. He was speaking through an interpreter. There was an event that was held for the people involved in the encampment, the students and non-students that were there, and he said something incredible. Right? We all asked. Like, after everything that's happening, the genocide that's going on, and it was declared a genocide by that point. How do you feel, right? In terms of these solutions that are sort of proffered to the Palestinian people, and he just said straight with a complete blank look, right? Like no emotion, like it's just a matter of fact for him. It's like, yeah, we did what we did, and we would do it again, right? The two-state solution is not a solution. How can you accept this occupation to begin with? That is what they feel. And it's incredible, despite all the death and destruction and so forth, so many of them. And of course, it's not something you would ask any of them now, right? Given what they're going through. But it's like deep down they know that it's a force that you cannot compromise with. It's not looking for that.
And you fight to the death. إما شهادة وإما النصر.
Subhanallah.
You either die a shaheed or you have victory. It's إحدى الحسنيين, one of the two good things that Allah promises you. When you fight with honor,
and that I think
the victory or martyrdom.
That I think scares people. I think it scares the living daylights out of people. And that is wahan in a nutshell. That is what Rasulullah ﷺ foretold for this ummah, when it would be so numerous in number, but it would be so much like the froth of the ocean. And I think that is our reality in this country manifest. We fear death so much. Really, I think that's what it is, right? Because you push these people, and it's like, what are we afraid of? It's like, well, it's going to be violent. It's going to be destructive. It's going to be, and to really what's underlying it is, I'm worried. I'm scared. I think that's what it is. It doesn't matter how long your beard is, how many Islamic qualifications you've got. They're scared of death. And I think this is the point.
And it's not like it's our lives that are at risk.
No, it's
Those
not.
on the ground have accepted that risk.
That's right.
Everyone of us that tells you, I am a martyr in the making. I'm awaiting my martyrdom. There's nothing else. I accept it. And we'll keep doing what we need to do to survive, to push back. We're not leaving our land. Anas Sharif rahmatullah alayhi said, I do not leave Gaza except to go to Jannah.
Subhanallah.
This is their mentality. But we're sitting here imposing upon them, look, just accept something and stop fighting back.
Yeah.
That's the arrogance that comes from the West. Yeah. And that's the arrogance that comes from this secularization, this intellectual colonization of our ummah, that the West comes with their solutions and will accept whatever they give us.
And it's like, we have to have our cake and eat it too, right? That we want this sense that we're fighting for the Palestinians, but we want a solution that doesn't put us in trouble. I think that's what's really going on. They've chosen the life of struggle and death and martyrdom, but we, to tick the box that, at least we stood on the side of the Palestinians, but the solution that we want instead is not one that has any struggle involved. It's the easy one that means that we can continue living our lives, building our centers, building our massive monuments to Western Islam and so on and so forth. That I honestly think psychologically that's what's going on.
Yeah. Can I end with one final point?
Sure.
I think there are some benefits to take out of the Western states recognizing Palestine as a state. I think when we try to always judge any action, any event, we need to take it back to what's our greater goal. Yeah. Our greater goal is the liberation of Palestine. And in my mind, the way that we get there is two things that we need to do. We need to sever the connection and the power that the Zionists gain from the West, all of the funding, the political coverage, the media coverage and so on that protects them. And then the second is that we need to mobilize the Ummah towards the liberation of Palestine.
Yeah, that protection needs to be broken, absolutely.
And so this is somehow or another symbolic of that. I think it does a few things. Number one is it infuriates the Zionists and it turns them even harsher against, like they call Albanese a Hamas agent or whatever, right? And the same to the UK and to Canada and so on, despite everything they've done to support them. So it increases that rift, that barrier that exists between these Western countries and the Zionist project and the people especially. And it also represents that shift in people's sentiments.
100%,
that people are pushing to the point that these governments are now saying that we need to give more and more and more concessions. This concession means absolutely nothing. But it is a fact that these countries have not done this before. So they're doing something they haven't done before to try to appease the people. And they'll have to keep on doing this more and more and more and sever their ties with the Zionists so that inshallah, when the Ummah does mobilize, we will see as little resistance from the rest of the world as possible. And they'll say, of course, this is a natural consequence of all of these Zionist crimes, is that their entity will be dismantled.
I mean, look, at a very, very, very macro level, that's a very good point, right? It's undeniable that, and this is, I think, the qadr Allah. Like he sort of shifts things in a certain direction, which in hindsight look like, yeah, you can see all the signs there, right? So it may be that something that, clearly, which is actually very, very harmful, the idea of the two-state and what it represents and so forth, as we've discussed today, it is harmful. But even that, even the some people pushing for that and some states pushing for that, recognizing that and so forth, even in that there will be and could be benefit. And I'm sure that's the case. That's just how Allah Sunnah works. But it's a very good point that, this is a sign of the breaking of the public opinion or the sign of the breaking of the consensus in the West. And a split West on this issue is a good thing for the Muslims. And there are so many signs of that. I mean, it's not even just this recognition issue. There's so many signs in the media, in the podcast world, everywhere. They're everywhere now, right? And I think it's impossible to deny that. So, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take things further down that path, to make it easier and easier and easier for us to see something that we've never seen, which is a true parting of the ways. And for that power base that underlies the entity to pull the rug from under their feet, and they will not last a single day when that happens.
Amen.
And there's for all that we've said about all these useless Arab states, the reality is that right next door there's a very exciting thing that's happened, and there are 20 million people there that are willing to march tomorrow if they were told. And I'm sure in Egypt and even in Jordan, the average Muslim who is not in the state institutions or is not part of the sort of the state infrastructure, deep down they have such good hearts, and everyone is waiting for the opportunity. And Absolutely. Come the right time, inshallah, it will be like it'll be over like that. Absolutely. I think it's that sort of thing, inshallah. We can see how quickly reality can change, and I think this is one of those instances. And to be very frank, we saw it earlier this year, right, with the so-called 12-day war. How feeble under the surface this artificially propped up entity really, really is. Like if it was a fair fight 1-to-1, they would be gone. They would be gone against Iran, which has lived under sanctions for decades upon decades upon decades. And I think that's something that's really worth recognizing.
I think the biggest blanket over the truth in that time is the fact that the Ben Gurion airport was closed. And I think if it were open, we would have seen the large numbers of the Zionist settlers that would have went fleeing towards Europe and America within these 12 days. But to their benefit, the airport was closed, and their only path was the few ships that sailed towards Cyprus and the few that managed to
And they were full. They were full, weren't they? SubhanAllah. So, when it happens fast. And I'm sure that will be the case. Thank you so much, Mohammed. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for shedding light on the history. Fascinating. Really helps you understand the present. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the courage to stand on the side of what is right, to not relent in our activism, in our work, in our advocacy, and to continue really speaking for our brothers and sisters in Gaza and in Palestine more generally. Inshallah, the day will come, and on that day, this woman will rejoice. Jazakumullah khair. Brothers and sisters, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that was an enlightening episode. We hope it shed light on some important history, and that it helps connect you to the Palestinian cause at a deeper level, helps you advocate, helps you really, make sure that you hone in on what's going on in a deep and meaningful way, that you see past the charades and really look to what the real possibilities are for this great land if we take what is a principled and prophetic path, inshallah. We'll see you again next time on the Stand4Palestine podcast. Remember once again to subscribe, like, comment, do all that sort of funky stuff, because I'm told to say it and it's good for the podcast apparently. So just do it, inshallah. And we will see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.